Hi guys, so this is chapter 13 and it goes over the brain and cranial nerves, and we'll start by orienting ourselves with the divisions of the nervous system. So I have here just a simple diagram of the nervous system, and we have the brain and the spinal cord, which make up the central nervous system, and then everything else is included in the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so the divisions are sensory, and the other name you learned in lab for sensory is afferent. Sometimes it's just referred to as the input message. Remember, it receives or senses a stimulus and then takes that message in the form of electricity or electrical message, and then it's processed within the central nervous system, and then interneurons process that information and then take it out to a motor neuron. And remember, the other names for motor neuron are efferent, and sometimes it's just referred to as the output message. Okay, so there are different flavors of motor neurons. Sometimes they're just the somatic motor neurons, and remember, those take messages to skeletal muscle, which we would deem voluntary. And then the other ones are called visceral. Some of them, you'll notice that visceral motor neurons are made up of two neurons. Some of them are, the second one is long, and then the other ones are short. The second one is short. And those take messages to smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and then glands. And typically we call this the autonomic nervous system, which is involuntary. And there are actually two branches of that, parasympathetic, or sometimes referred to as the rest and digest, and then the sympathetic autonomic nervous system, or the fight or flight. Okay, so now we have this sort of organization set out, organization of the nervous system. Let's sort of focus on this side, the sensory neurons, the afferent or input message. And remember, even if there's a cell body within the spinal cord, it has neural or axons, part of the neuron outside of the central nervous system, and therefore is considered part of the peripheral nervous system. Okay. So we have different flavors of sensory receptors. Remember, they're receiving the stimulus, and they come in a few different flavors. Some of them are mechanoreceptors, and will receive things like touch, or sense things like touch, pressure, and like with hearing, it receives vibration against the tympanic membrane. Then we have thermoreceptors that sense temperature, and interestingly enough, we actually have more cold thermoreceptors than we do hot thermoreceptors. Nociceptors sense pain. And if any one of these stimuli are big enough, they can actually be received as pain. So for instance, if you hear a loud enough sound, it can actually cause your ears to hurt. Photoreceptors are only found in the eye and sense light. And chemoreceptors sense chemicals and deal with things like taste and smell. Here's just a diagram of the peripheral nervous system, and here we have a spinal nerve and its divisions, and it's a lot like the divisions we learned for a skeletal muscle. Make sure you know what a fascicle is. It's a bundle of neurons, and we have, this is not supposed to be perineuron, it's supposed to be epineurium. Different layers of connective tissue that surround each layer of organization. Okay, and this is just a myelinated neuron and then an unmyelinated neuron. So here you can see the myelination that insulate the axon. And in the peripheral nervous system, they're not called oligodendrocytes. The cells that produce the myelin are called Schwann cells. I think it's 2 A's, Schwann cell. Okay. Okay, so this is actually part of chapter 12, but I'm going to go ahead and include it. I will not ask you, I don't believe I asked you about a demyelinating disease, but I do ask that you know that with neurons, most central nervous system fibers do not regenerate, meaning they cannot repair themselves, but most peripheral nervous system nerve fibers can repair themselves. But if the cell body, the soma, is damaged, it cannot repair. Okay, it is essentially dead. So now we can talk about brain development. So this is happening in utero, in your mom's belly. So when the sperm and the egg combine their DNA, they will form a single cell called a zygote. And then that zygote, that single cell, will go through mitosis and cell differentiation, where the cells will become different things. Like some of the cells will become the cardiac cells, some will become the gastrointestinal tract, and then some will become the nervous system. And then eventually we end up with what will become you. That's supposed to be a hat. And then around about 4 weeks, during all this, at about 4 weeks, it develops, some of those cells develop the neural tube. That's the very beginning of what will become your nervous system. Then towards the cranial end, that's the head, the end that will become the brain, versus the caudal end, that's towards the tail, start to go through mitosis a little bit more, and we get the swelling. They go through mitosis even more, and we form the primary brain vesicles. You learn these in lab. They're the prosencephalon, the mesencephalon, and then the rhombencephalon. Okay. It goes through mitosis even more, and they start to differentiate even more into separate structures, and we form the secondary brain vesicles. I will ask you to know these vesicles, so make sure that you know these vesicles and can identify them. So the secondary ones will become what your adult structures will be. So the prosencephalon turns into the telencephalon and the diencephalon encephalon. Mesencephalon stays the same, or is still the mesencephalon. The rhombencephalon turns into two. The metencephalon and the myelencephalon. Okay? So what we'll do next is we'll take these primary brain vesicles, look at each one, and talk about what each primary or secondary brain vesicle becomes in the adult brain. Okay, so the telencephalon becomes the cerebrum in the adult brain, which is the left and right hemisphere of the brain, and that includes all the lobes within it. The cerebrum is under conscious control. And the frontal lobe, underneath the frontal bone, gives us our personality. The temporal bone gives us, it's right by the ear, it gives us hearing. And weirdly, smell. The parietal lobe, which is right behind and right behind the frontal lobe and right above the temporal lobe, gives us general senses. And then the occipital lobe, which is the lobe that is most posterior, is where we get sight. There's one more lobe, which is the insula, which is a deep cerebral structure, which I've tried to draw in for you here in green, and it gives us taste. And these are the sort of things that I would ask you. I would ask you which lobe is associated with which sort of thing. So like the frontal lobe is associated with personality and so forth. There's a few more structures I want you to know, like the precentral gyrus, which is located here, and it's part of the frontal lobe, and it's considered the primary motor cortex, whereas the postcentral gyrus, which is, remember, gyrus is a projection, whereas the sulcus is what separates the two, is a groove. The postcentral gyrus is considered the primary somatosensory cortex. Okay. Now to view the structures that arise from the diencephalon, we need to look deep to the cerebrum. And one of those structures is the epithalamus. Epi, remember, means upon the thalamus. And from the epithalamus we have the pineal gland, which produces a hormone, melatonin. Melatonin helps to regulate our dark and light cycles, so your sleep cycles. The thalamus, shaded here in red, located underneath or within the corpus callosum, which connects the right and left hemispheres. So the thalamus is sort of the gateway to consciousness. And then the hypothalamus is sort of like the master control of the brain, and it does so many things. And so we're going to say that its basic function is homeostasis, maintaining balance within the body, or regulating balance within the body. If you continue down inferior, we get the pituitary gland. Connected by a structure called the infundibulum, which I'm sure you learned in lab. Now we have 3 more brain vesicles to talk about. The first one is the mesencephalon. Remember, this one is the same in the primary brain vesicle. And what this turns into in the adult brain is basically often referred to as the midbrain. I think these might be mislabeled in your notes, so make sure that these are correct. It is correct, what you're looking at right now. So the mesencephalon turns into the midbrain and includes the cerebral peduncles, which is sort of located more anteriorly. So these are the cerebral peduncles right here. And then also the tactile plate, or I think you learned in lab that it's called the corpora quadrigemina. And from here we get what's called reflexive stimuli. So they're sort of those nodule-looking structures. They call them superior and inferior coniuliculi. And we get reflexive stimuli in the eyes and in the ears. Now in the metencephalon, this includes the pons and the cerebellum. And what those are responsible for, the pons helps to regulate breathing. And then the cerebellum, it connects to the spinal cord. But it controls fine. I jumped ahead. It controls fine and complex motor control. It also allows us to learn routines. It allows us to learn routines. So I'm talking about the cerebellum. That's the bell-like structure underneath the cerebellum, or from the cerebrum. It's the bell-like structure underneath the cerebrum. Now the last brain vesicle is the melencephalon. And it turns into the medulla oblongata. And the medulla oblongata is this final structure here, and this is the one that continues on and turns into the spinal cord, and it controls sort of primitive control things like breathing and heart rate. It's the most primitive part of the brain. It's the most primitive part of the brain. Okay? Alright, so now I want to discuss cerebral spinal fluid, or CSF, and then the ventricles of the brain. So CSF not only provides some cushion to the brain structures, but it also sort of cleanses and nourishes the brain. So you have 4 total ventricles within the brain. The first 2 lateral, those are the biggest of the ventricles. The third, that's sort of surrounding the thalamus region, and then the 4th, which is closest to the cerebellum. You also have a hole in which it drains out of and then surrounds the rest of the spinal cord and then the brain, and that hole's called the aperture. And then the CSF flows into a space and surrounds the brain and the spinal cord. So it's important that you know the structures and then the spaces. And those structures are called the meninges. So the outermost structure is called the dura mater, and is the most durable and is the most superficial connective tissue structure. that surrounds the brain and the spinal cord. The space below it then is called the subdural space. And then underneath the subdural space, we have another layer called the arachnoid mater. It's the web-like layer. It looks like a spider web. And then it creates a space called the subarachnoid space. And it is within this space that CSF flows. Underneath that, we have another layer called the pia mater, which is the innermost layer and lies directly on the brain structures. The only space I didn't mention is the one on the outside of the most durable layer, the dura mater, and it is between this layer and the bone, and that's called the epidural space. So I'll ask you questions about this, and I know you'll get questions about this in lab, so make sure that you know this. One other structure that I'd like you to know that I know you also need to know for lab is the choroid plexus. This is also where the ependymal cells are located, and I've highlighted them here in red. They're located within the ventricles. I know you have a model like this in lab, and if you turn the model upside down, you can see little highlighted pink areas. That's called the choroid plexus, and they have ependymal cells that produce cerebral spinal fluid. Alright. So in this next section, I want to talk about your cranial nerves and give you a little tip on how to learn your cranial nerves. In this picture, you're looking at the underside of the brain, and this being the anterior, and then this being posterior. Okay? So I've drawn right here a sort of simplified version with the pons, and then the medulla oblongata looking, sort of like a four-fingered glove. And the cranial nerves basically all go downwards in number. And they use Roman numerals to list these cranial nerves. So we see here at the very top we have cranial nerve number 1. And that's the olfactory nerve. And that's, where we get smell. And then cranial nerve number 2 is right here. The ocular motor nerve, which is cranial nerve number 3, is coming right out of the pons, at the top of the pons right here. The trochlear nerve, which is cranial nerve number 4, is, if we continue on down the side of the pons, is coming out right here. The trigeminal nerve is cranial nerve number 5. It's a pretty big one, and it has 3 branches. It sort of looks like it only has 2, but it has 3 branches, and it's pretty thick. It's right here. So if we continue on going down the side of the pons, it's right there. And then the abducens nerve, which is cranial nerve number 6, starts back up at the top of the medulla oblongata. The facial nerve, cranial nerve number 7, is coming off right here. So we're continuing on down. Use a different color here. Vestibular cochlear nerve, remember that's referring to the ear, as cranial nerve number 8. And if we continue on going downwards, it's the next one in line, so it's this one right here. The glossopharyngeal, glosso basically referring to the tongue, is cranial nerve number 9. That's this one right here. So yeah, we're keeping on with our trend and going downwards, down the side of the medulla oblongata. Cranial nerve number 10 is another big one. It's the vagus nerve. The way I remember that is that you do it big in vagus, and it is a big nerve. And then this one's easy to remember. It's the accessory nerve. It's cranial nerve number 11. And it's the one that looks sort of, let me erase this real quick. It's the one that sort of looks like a necklace going down the side. So it's this one right here, going down the side of the medulla oblongata. Now the only one that doesn't follow this downward trend is the hypoglossal nerve. It's the very last one, cranial nerve number 12. And you have to go back up to the medulla oblongata, to the two middle fingers of that four-finger glove. And it's this one right here. Okay, so let me show you an easy way of how to draw this out and try and learn these cranial nerves, these 12 cranial nerves. So yeah, you have 12 cranial nerves that you're responsible for knowing. Okay, so 1 through 11 follow this trend of downward motion. So number 1 starts up here. That's cranial nerve number 1, the olfactory nerve. And then following this trend is cranial nerve number 2, and I even crossed it for you because that's how the optic nerve does. And then number 3, cranial nerve number 3 comes out the top of the pons. That's that one. Then if we follow our trend and go down the side of the pons, cranial nerve number 4, which is the trochlear nerve, and then cranial nerve number 5, remember, is a big one, and it's the one that I say it sort of looks like a goose foot. Looks like this. It has 3 branches. That's the trigeminal nerve. It's cranial nerve number 5. Continuing with our trend, going downwards, cranial nerve number 6. We have to start back up at the medulla oblongata, the top of the medulla oblongata. And then continuing on down, cranial nerve number 7, which is the facial nerve. We keep moving on down. Cranial nerve number 8, which is the vestibular cochlear nerve. Remember, that's the one that deals with the ear. Cranial nerve number 9 is the glossopharyngeal, refers to the tongue and the throat. And then remember that really thick one on the side of the medulla oblongata is cranial nerve number 10, the vagus nerve, because you do it big in Vegas. And then one of my favorite ones that looks like a necklace down the side of the medulla oblongata is the accessory nerve, cranial nerve number 11. And oddly enough, it deals with a neck muscle. And where do you wear accessories? Like a necklace around your neck. So then our very last one is the weird one that doesn't follow this trend. And it's cranial nerve number 12, the hypoglossal nerve, that also deals with the tongue. Okay, so hopefully that will help you in learning these cranial nerves. So on your exam, I will show you a picture like this and ask that you be able to identify them. Okay, so now in this section, I know in your notes I have listed fiber types. And the S stands for sensory, the M stands for motor, and B stands for both. On this exam, I won't ask you fiber types, but I will ask that you know the names of the cranial nerves and what they do. So for instance, cranial nerve number 1 is the olfactory nerve and is responsible for smell. Cranial nerve number 2 is the optic nerve and is responsible for sight. Cranial nerve number 3, ocular motor, is responsible for 4 eye muscles. Cranial nerve number 4 is the trochlear nerve and is responsible for 1 eye muscle. Cranial nerve number 5 is the trigeminal, and the trigeminal technically has 3 branches, and V1, V2, and V3 branch. So one of them actually goes to the eye, and they call that the ophthalmic branch. The other one goes to the maxillary region. And then the V3 goes to the mandible and is the mandibular branch. Okay? So like these two are responsible for sensory stuff to the skin. And then this is the only one that is muscular. So it's responsible for things like chewing. Okay. So cranial nerve number 6 is the abducens, and it is responsible for 1 eye muscle. Cranial nerve number 7 is the facial nerve, and we get facial expressions from that one. Cranial nerve number 8 is the vestibular cochlear nerve, so from there we get hearing and balance. And then cranial nerve number 9 is the glossopharyngeal nerve, and we get things like taste and swallowing. It's actually responsible for the posterior 1/3 of the tongue. So the posterior 1/3 of the tongue. Cranial nerve number 10, remember that's the vagus nerve, and it has many different functions. So it's actually has some visceral motor fibers like to everything. So for like the heart, the lungs, your guts, just many different things. Cranial nerve number 11 is the accessory cranial nerve, and remember I said that's to the neck muscles. Cranial nerve number 12, that's the hypoglossal cranial nerve, and it's responsible for the tongue. Okay. Alright. So again, I'm not going to ask you fiber types, but I will ask that you know what the cranial nerves do. These are the only cranial nerves right here that are responsible for having both sensory and motor. So I did mention that some of your cranial nerves had visceral motor fibers within them. Remember, those are under involuntary control, and those are cranial nerve number 3, which is the ocular motor, cranial nerve number 7, which is the facial, cranial nerve number I think I wrote that wrong. That's supposed to be an X. Sorry. It's cranial nerve number 9, which is the glossopharyngeal, and then cranial nerve number 10, which is the vagus nerve. So all of those have visceral motor nerves under involuntary control. Alright, so that concludes the lecture on chapter 13, and I'll make one for chapter 14 soon. So happy studying.